On the show, we're going to have a dear friend of mine, a tremendous person. Her name is Theresa Brown. She is a nurse and a wonderful writer, and she wrote a great book called The Shift, about a nursing shift, and she's going to talk. We'll have a great time.
Welcome to Conversations with Shem. Our focus is to show how to put the human back into healthcare.
Welcome to this episode. We have our host, Dr. Samuel Shem. He is the author of The House of God and Man's Fourth Best Hospital, and he's a professor of medicine and medical humanities at NYU Grossman Medical School. And across from him, he is going to be joined today by Theresa Brown, who is a nurse and a New York Times best-selling author. So welcome.
Well, Theresa, welcome. You're one of my favorite authors, and you're a wonderful person. And it's a great thing to actually have just you and me, no great other people with us, to talk about something that we both feel very, very uh, uh, strongly about, which is what's gone wrong with medicine, the humanity in medicine, and how do we put the humanity back in there. And you have had such great experience, broad experience as a writer and as a nurse. This is really unique. So I'm going to try to not talk too much, because I think people really want to hear what someone who was on the front lines in nursing, and that's written about it in a wonderful nonfiction book. And what do you think about how things are going?
Yeah, well, thanks for the lovely introduction. People should know that Shem and I met because I was invited to blurb his book, Man's Fourth Best Hospital, and I was just literally blown away by it because it's, of course, he has a gift for satire. We all knew that, but the updating of all the characters from the first famous book, and bringing in the electronic healthcare system and how it's really ruining healthcare. And he did that so brilliantly. I was just so impressed, and made me so fond of him. And then we got to know each other, and I wrote a column together on the same topic for the New York Times. So that was very fortuitous. But I would say there are so many things now that pull us away from patients and the bedside, and doing bureaucratic work, doing billing work. I mean, I think what nurses and doctors each have to do is different. For us, there's a lot of boxes we have to check and questions we have to answer when we're charting on patients, and those seem to become more and more complicated as time goes by. and just incredibly time consuming. And for me, there's this incredible pressure of feeling like I can make one mistake. I could leave something out of one box. And people probably think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. Depending on what that box is and what the mistake I make is. And it could be huge. It could make a big difference. Let's hope not for patient care, but in terms of, well, you didn't do this, and why didn't you do this? And you were supposed to do this. And this
Why
is,
don't you explain what a box is for people who don't
oh,
really know?
sorry. Yeah. So the charting that we do is just a whole series of drop-down menus, and there'll be all kinds of choices about how's the patient breathing, and you get 12 different choices. And seriously, describing a bowel movement, literally 20 different choices. That's not the kind of thing that it could get you in trouble, but it's, say I'm writing about side effects, someone is having to a medication, or that there was, had a suspicion that they had a fever, or I'm not thinking of a good example right now, I'm sorry. But if you can just imagine at your job, if you constantly had to go through drop-down menu after drop-down menu and pick something, and then keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. And then it was the whole 12 hours, there were these requirements to do this. It seems impossible not to make a mistake. And yet somehow we're expected to be perfect. And when I left the hospital and went to doing home hospice, which I loved, people warned me, the charting in home care is even worse.
Really?
Yeah. And if you do an admission in hospice, it's an unbelievable series of menus that will literally take 2 hours of just sitting there putting stuff in the computer to go through. And people should understand that's time I could be spending with a patient, right? That's time I could be talking with or helping someone who's dying, and which should be our priority for compassionate care. And instead, I'm checking boxes on a computer screen. And
What
there's just
about,
no sense to it.
why don't you tell everybody what was your excitement about going to become a nurse? Do you remember that? I mean, what was really that got you, which is sort of missing now?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so my background is I have a PhD in English from the University of Chicago. I taught at Tufts for 3 years, so I was in your neighborhood, Shem. And then it was having kids that really totally flipped my mind around. And I thought, wow, I don't want to be an academic the rest of my life. So then here I am, I'm in my 30s. I just spent 6 years getting a graduate degree. And I think, well, then what do I want to do? And then I got pregnant with twins. I had midwives with the twins. Was very interested about the pregnancy and everything. And when the girls were about 16 months old, we had a friend visit who was a nurse, who's also named Theresa. And I said, I just thought the midwives had the coolest job in the world. And she looked at me and she said, Theresa, you could do that job.
Really?
And no one had ever said that to me. You know how some families are healthcare families, like everyone does something in healthcare. We had no healthcare in my family. Literally, my dad growing up would call doctors quacks. It's just not something I ever thought about doing. But she planted a seed and I started to look into it. And then I found out, I wouldn't have to go back to school for 4 years. I could take some science classes and then do what's called an accelerated nursing program. And in a year and a half, 2 years, get my nursing degree. So literally a month later, I started in general chemistry. I was really sold. And what drew me in was really the experience of being so well cared for when I was pregnant. And I really had the best of everything that modern healthcare can offer. I had midwives with their very hands-on personable care, which of course OBGYNs can do that also. That was just my experience with them. But then I also had perinatologists, who most people probably don't even know that's a field, but they're physicians who specialize in babies before they're born. So lots of work with them and ultrasounds, and it was just amazing to me what modern medicine could do. And then when the girls were born, and by the way, they just turned 22, so this was a while ago, but when the girls were born, I always tell people I fell in love with the mess of life. And a lot of people don't get that. But see, you're nodding. I think people in healthcare get that. When I say that to nurses, they always get it. Just the sort of chaos of bodies and diapers, but also love and warmth and caring. And that's what really took me into nursing. And that's,
And that was really kind of old time nursing, and you wrote beautifully about it in your first book, which was a bestseller. Tell me the name again. I'm sorry.
oh, that's okay. The second book, it's called The Shift, One Nurse, 12
Yeah,
Hours, Four
right.
Patients Live. Right.
Everybody should read that. It's a classic in nursing, and so you melded those two threads that you had, well, three if you count your family, into nursing. And it sounds like you really kind of felt valued. You enjoyed it. It was hands-on. You got to think. You got to cry. You got to laugh. What's happened? Not to you, I mean, but to us, to all of us.
Yeah, I loved that job, and it's a long story about why I left. And I also loved doing home hospice, and I really wanted to see people in their homes. But that's why I went into home care, is actually a good illustration of what's wrong with healthcare, because I started to feel like we never saw people at their best in the hospital. We never saw them as full people. And this is, I'm talking about working on an oncology floor where we got to know our patients. We had people who stayed there for 1 month, 2 months, sometimes 3 months at a time. So we really knew them, we knew their families. And yet increasingly, I felt like we just were not able to see them as human beings, that there's such a sense of rush. There's a lot of chaos in the hospital. I think people don't understand how chaotic it is. And there's no slack in the system.
Mhm.
And that's a huge problem. So for nursing, that means if a nurse can't come in for whatever reason, often there's no one to take that nurse's place. So just everyone else, every nurse on the floor gets an extra patient. Well, you can imagine how angry this makes everyone at that nurse who came in sick. So then there's this culture of you have to be tough enough to never take time off work, which, in the middle of a pandemic is just a recipe for disaster, right? But so because there's no slack, we create this culture of everybody has to be super tough and super nurse, and you can do everything, which is impossible. Nobody can live up to that standard. But then there's no slack in other ways, like the hospital didn't want to have as many transporters, the people who take patients from procedure back to their room. And so they cut the number of transporters. And then if a transporter came up to get your patient and your patient wasn't ready in 3 minutes or 5 minutes or something, they had to leave. And it's so hard, I think, for people to get how much pressure that feels like. But imagine you have a cancer patient and they've started showing very weird cognitive symptoms. Like I'll just make something up. They've started talking in gibberish. And so they're going to go for a scan of their head to see what's going on in their brain, which is really, really important. But when the transporter comes up, because you don't know exactly when they're coming, another patient is suddenly vomiting profusely. And so they need to be cared for and they need medication. And there's no one else available because it was a call off. And, sometimes you have one aide and sometimes you have three. And this is a day when we have one. And so I can't get my patient ready, or feel tremendous pressure to get that patient ready so she can go for that head CT, so we can find out what's wrong with her brain. You can't just say, well, we can't take this patient right now. And then I would call CT and they would say, well, we don't have space. Like, that was your time and you blew it. Not in those words, but that would be the idea. So the tremendous pressure on individual nurses, and I'm sure there are MDs who have similar situations,
Yeah, but
to
you
make
know,
it work is very tough.
yeah. Well, to the present, as we talk, I can't remember the name of the hospital in Worcester, Mass, where the nurses went out on strike because, I mean, the big thing that's happening. I mean, you're talking about what's wrong with healthcare now. I mean, nurses are the best and the worst treatment, but getting the best and the worst treatment in some ways, or the best way to stick together. But it's really about how many patients, right, is a load for a
Right.
nurse to carry in the COVID or in whatever else. And they are just, they can't, it's dangerous what the private equity owner of this hospital, and the owner is in Dallas,
Yeah.
is doing here. And what the last thing, they're still out on strike, but what they did is they spent $37 million, the hospital, this chain hospital, um, to hire other nurses that would take the job. And that's much less than what the nurses are asking for to settle. So
Wow.
what about that? What about what's going on with nurses now, with private equity owning so many of these things for profit? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, it's good to bring up staffing. I think I first wrote about this for the New York Times 10 years ago, which was
Uh,
when Linda Aiken at UPenn came out with big study showing the more patients a nurse has above a certain number. So let's say in an ICU, it's usually two. It's usually one nurse, two patients. So you give that nurse three patients, or all the nurses in ICU, three patients. Her research showed that there are patients who will die as a result of that, who would not have died otherwise. And I realized I'm so naive, because I thought, wow, if people know this, then things are going to change, because we don't want people to just die in healthcare when they wouldn't have otherwise. But they didn't. And Linda keeps producing this work, and it's not changing things. Then COVID came along, and suddenly so many nurses had to work. We call it working short-staffed. And I wrote a column for the New York Times just about everything that nurses have gone through.
yeah.
And the things that these nurses said about staffing, I mean, one nurse in particular, I said, this is a really hard question, but do you feel like patients died who might not have otherwise because you were understaffed? And she said, yeah, we just couldn't take care of people the way we needed to because we were so overwhelmed. And, some of that, right? It's a pandemic. No one expected the rush of people. Some of that is situational, but what people need to understand is nurses are increasingly working in short-staffed environments, and had been before COVID. So just to say, well, of course, ICUs got overwhelmed when New York was overwhelmed, or whatever, is not looking at what's actually happening, which this has become more and more normal. And in California, they have staffing ratios. You're hearing other states talking about it. But yeah, when you have companies owning hospitals that all they're really interested in is how much money can we squeeze out of this hospital, nurses are going to get burned out and have moral injury, but patients are going to die. And I really, really wish the general public understood that. I think healthcare is at a bit of a disadvantage politically, because people don't really get what the hospital's like unless they've been there or they've had someone there. And I think it's easy for people to think, oh, because the food is really good, that the hospital's really good, or there are little sort of you know, pleasant things that they do for patients. But patients need to understand that in the US, and people hate it when I say this, like, you're just scaring me, I can't do anything about this. Like, well, but it's true, whether I tell you or not, it's still true that a nurse understaffing is serious risk to patients.
Right.
And we're seeing
The
it
other
happen
thing-
more and more often.
The other thing, though, is I always, when I speak about my books, and especially with Man's Fourth Best Hospital, which is, set now in all this stuff with the electronic medical records and the focus on money going wild. What I hold up as a banner, and you can tell me if I'm just dreaming, of the fact that nurses have unions, and nurses pretty much, I think, when they threaten a strike or even go out on strike, they usually win what they need. I mean, this is an example now, it's probably in its second month where they're not getting anything from the hospital chain. But what do you think about the nurses getting together? Why can nurses have a union and get together and have power? Because they almost always win, and doctors don't. They never, not a day. They don't go, there hasn't been a daily strike probably since the 60s. And that was the house staff in New York of the hospital.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's complicated, right? And I think unions definitely benefit nurses. There's no question. There also is a fair amount of anti-union feeling among some nurses for all kinds of complicated reasons. I mean, I wonder if physicians see themselves as kind of at the top of the pyramid. And so, well, we're protected, but then I know there's so many doctors right now who are not happy with their work environment, who are burned out. I mean, the suicide rate for physicians is twice the general population, right?
Oh, yes.
And I just found out the suicide rate for nurses who are women, it's not the same for men, but nurses who are women is twice the rate of women in the general population.
Yeah.
These are scary, sobering statistics. And I wonder if doctors felt like their position and high salaries and education that they've gone through would protect them. And I think what they're seeing, and I've heard it here in Pittsburgh with one of our healthcare systems, is the people in the C-suite, the corporate people, they don't care. To them, doctors are just employees. Like, you could be a doctor, you could be someone who works in a parking lot for the hospital, right? You're an employee.
Yeah.
And I imagine that it's very hard to accept that and then think, well, what am I gonna do about that?
Yeah, it is. But yeah, doctors, I think part of it is the male to female ratio in nurses. It certainly was. Doctors is now equal with women. But anyway, I have some hope that things are actually going to get better, because it can't, hope comes from a situation like this.
Mm-hmm.
Arises in how awful it is for patients, doctors, nurses, and only better for the administrators.
We could change a lot of this tomorrow. We could give Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices with companies.
Yes.
I just read about, someone who got really rich running hospices. And the whole idea of a for-profit hospice to me is an oxymoron.
That's really threatening for death. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we say everyone who takes Medicare has to be not-for-profit, and then make stricter rules about what it means to be a not-for-profit, because here in Pittsburgh, we've seen not-for-profits that behave like for-profits. They don't have shareholders, but I mean, I think they're not quite as bad as the large for-profit national chains, but they're certainly not good employers.
As you know, in Man's Fourth Best Hospital, which is about the injustice of the medical care system now. I wrote about the fat man in the book, gives a lecture on the 6 rackets of American healthcare, quote, follow the money. And I had to study really to get this right for 2 months or something, because they're all intertwined. And what he suggests at the end, which I think I talked about before to you, is he says, we've got to squeeze the money out of the machines. We've got to squeeze the money out of the billing machines. And like, the VA, people are much more happy who work there, because there's only, for an appendectomy, for instance, there's only one price basically all throughout the country. You're not arguing with an insurance person. So anyway, I think things are gonna get better. But before we end, I just want to ask you if you want to mention your new book. I know you've been working on it, and it's due pretty soon. When is it?
Yeah, thank you. It should be coming out next spring or summer. Yeah, we're still debating the title. It may be called Healing.
That's good.
So wish I could give you the real title, but it's about, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and which was very treatable, and I'm okay. But what I saw being on the other side as a patient is all the problems. And I thought, as a nurse, at the start of my book, The Shift, I talk about every day I come in and I'm pushing a rock up a hill, and hoping that I don't lose control of it, very standard metaphor, right? And I always thought, as a nurse, if I give 120%, that's going to make up for whatever the system is not giving. And as a patient, I realized it's not true. Like, it's not that anything so terrible happened to me, but there were so many instances of I don't think inhumanity is too strong a word, just relative to what I was going through. Like, suddenly, out of the blue, of course, I'm told, oh, you have breast cancer. And it's like, what? And just so little compassion throughout my course of treatment. And so the book is telling that story, but also making a plea for compassion. And I do agree with you. I think if there are enough of us who can push for that, it will make a difference. I'm hoping the book will really make a difference. But and that's why I'm focused on this idea of healing, because it's one thing to fix something or to cure someone, very important, but healing is different. It's, more the whole person. It feels almost spiritual. And that's really what we've lost. We need to get that back.
And I love that word. Healing is a funny word, because it at the same time, it's you healing, it's healing someone else. Heal. And that's the essence of course, what I preach all the time when I go out and talk, which is the mutuality of care in the system. And as Chuck, the Black intern, said at the end of The House of God, when they asked, what's the matter, Huck? Why are you so unhappy about this whole year? And he said, man, how can you care for patients if nobody cares for us?
Right.
And that's the worm in the apple right now. So you're a wonderful friend and a great writer, and I'm so happy that I know you, and can't wait to read the book. Yeah.
Likewise. Yeah.
Thank you. That was wonderful to have the perspective from, quote, a nurse, and a smart and a wonderful and a writer nurse, about what's going on in healthcare and what to do about it. And she really had the inside dope about it. And I haven't really heard